Okay, session is being recorded. So, where we left off, slide 12 here, talking about encryption, right? So we just finished up strong passwords, weak passwords, multi-factor authentication. Next thing, encryption. So, one thing, when you're storing passwords in a database, you really don't want to store them as plain text, right? As just the exact password that somebody types in. Because if you do that, then if a hacker gains access to your database, then boom, your whole system is pretty much blown wide open, right? What happens in general, these databases store passwords in encrypted or some other form of garbled format. For example, some years ago, a dude hacked eBay and got encrypted passwords for literally hundreds of millions of accounts. But since they're encrypted, right, the dude didn't have the technology to break the encryption on them. I mean, maybe he would some years down the road if this quantum computing is a thing. But for the moment, doesn't have anything like the power to break the passwords. Decides he's going to shop them around on the dark web. Last I saw, he was trying to sell the whole batch of like, X, 2 or 300 million passwords for something like $50 because it's basically worthless. Okay, so encryption algorithms essentially convert plain text to some sort of scrambled gibberish, right? And the key point is that it's reversible. You can, in some way, figure out here's the encrypted data, and then you can decrypt it to read the original message. For example, if you send an encrypted email to someone, right, you have your original plain text, you put it through some encryption process that scrambles it all up so no outsider can read it. And when it gets to the intended recipient, they can decrypt it so they can actually read the email, right? Another related thing, something called hashing. So hashing is a kind of scrambling into groups, right? Which is not necessarily reversible or with a one-to-one correspondence. So, for example, you know what? We'll push off hashing till we actually need to talk about it. That's fine. But these are the two things we're going to talk about, encryption and then subsequently hashing. And if you're interested, I have a link there so you can check that out. All right. So first thing we're going to talk about here, asymmetric encryption. So we have two people, Yvonne and Zoe, and they want to communicate through email, but they have to send their messages over an open network. That means anything they send out could be captured and looked at by people. Well, they don't want that. They're like talking about boys and crushes and stuff like that, and they don't want people to know. So how can they encrypt their messages without fear of decryption by any intermediaries, right? The devices that the message is passing through, or eavesdroppers, people tapping into the network listening to what's going on. Well, if you scramble the message somehow, right, as long as no listeners can obtain the key, the mechanism for decrypting the message, that would be fine. And if Yvonne and Zoe share a common encryption system, then encryption is easy and safe, right? So think about on those submarines, they carry books that have a complete decoding scheme, right? So they can send out messages that are fully encrypted, and the other, submarines will be able to receive those messages encrypted. Yeah, as long as everybody has the same set of codes, I can send you a message, you can decrypt it, it's fine. So that's great for personal friends like Yvonne and Zoe. But the problem is if you try to extend that case to millions or billions or trillions of possible combinations of people, you'd have to have a unique coding scheme for each of them. Pain in the ass, right? And you'd basically be spending all your time developing these novel coding schemes. So it would be like if I want to run a credit keys without a listener also obtaining them, right? That's the question. Like if I'm going to a website and I want to have some sort of encrypted communications with that website, how can I set up an exchange with the website so that nobody else can listen in on what I'm sending? This is a big problem. Okay, well, the dominant way to do this is something called two-key encryption. And the essential idea, Yvonne and Zoe would each have two keys to lock and unlock messages. Basically, these are essentially big prime numbers. And the idea with this, I'm going to put it in Paint for a second because Paint is our friend. So the keys are basically big prime numbers. Okay, there's a little more to the algorithm than that, but that's the idea. Which means, number one, it's very quick to multiply them together, but B, very difficult to factor their product. Okay, if you multiply these two prime numbers together, there's a whole lot of possibilities that you have to consider, and it's extremely difficult to factor them. So that's what allows the outcome of that. Number one, can use the two keys to quickly encrypt messages, right? But the encrypted messages are very difficult to decrypt, right? Because essentially what you're doing is you're multiplying the message through by this number. And then if the other person knows what, the corresponding key number is, they can easily divide through and reverse it, but a random person couldn't just guess at how to do it. Okay? So I'm going to box this in red. Reason is this is serious computer science stuff, and you don't need to memorize it. It may help you understand how the scheme works. Okay, that's what I'm trying to do here. So if this all seems a little fuzzy, that's okay, don't sweat it, but this is essentially what's going on. Okay, so every person in this two-key encryption model, they have a public key, they have a private key, and that refers to how they're used, right? Basically, either one is interchangeable as a number, that's fine. But the difference is any message that gets encrypted with the public key will get decrypted by the private key, and vice versa. If you encrypt it with the private key, you can decrypt it quickly with the public key. Okay, and so in the well-known RSA encryption algorithm, yeah, the keys are big prime numbers. So the way you keep your messages safe, each user shares their public key and keeps their private key private. This is what I mean when I say the keys refer to usage, right? You don't have to pick which number is going to be which. Well, you do, but either one will work. And the nice thing about this model is if I can share the public key with everyone, right? Because someone who sends me a message, they encrypt it with my public key. And as long as only I have my private key, only I can decrypt that message. So it's extremely extensible to large pools of users. It doesn't require that many keys. If I were requiring a unique pair of keys, right, for every combination of communications, again, that would be a big pain. But this way, I have a public key, right? I share that all over the universe. I only need, the two keys for myself. And every user on the internet only needs the two keys for itself to send out encrypted messages. All right, so I'm going to check the chat here. There may have been some queries. Nope, nothing. Just people going on and off. Okay. Okay. So, example, right? We'll walk through this. So Yvonne and Zoe. So here's Yvonne. There's Zoe. They want to exchange stuff. Yvonne sends Zoe, call it Y public, right? Yvonne's public key. Okay. Zoe sends Yvonne Z public, right? Zoe's public key. That means when Zoe wants to send Yvonne a message, she encrypts it with Yvonne's public key, which only Yvonne's private key can decrypt, right? Likewise, when Yvonne wants to respond, she encrypts the response with Zoe's public key, and the resulting message can only be decrypted by Zoe's private key, which again is kept private by Zoe this time. Okay, so that's the scheme there. Okay, and that's essentially what's in this slide. So Yvonne wants to send a message to Zoe. Well, Zoe's already sent out the public key, right? Remember, these public keys, they can be exchanged, they can be shared out over the whole universe, and it's not really going to cause any problems because the only thing that can decrypt it is private key, which is kept private, and it would take a really, 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 really long time to guess at what the private key is, right? We're talking like all the computers on Earth working for centuries to get it. Now, again, yeah, some of this is going to get blown out of the water. They're going to need a new, more advanced scheme with quantum computing, but for now, it's good enough. Okay, now, hashing. Suppose Yvonne wants to send a message to Zoe, but she's aware that her little brother Xerxes might tamper with it. So, how can Zoe verify that any received message is in fact unchanged? Well, one simple method to do that is a hash function. Okay, so I'll give an example of a hash function here. Okay, so we'll write out here hash function to detect tampering. Okay, and a checksum is kind of a hash function. So imagine that you have a long series of, let's say, 12-digit numbers. Okay, and at the end, you want to detect whether the message was corrupted in transit. Okay, this is a serious thing. Well, one way to do that, one way to achieve that is to simply total up. Okay, well, I mean, the first thing to do, all right, so let's bear in mind, number one, actually cross-checking every number is going to take a very long time, especially over a networked connection, right? So you don't want to do that. You don't want to go through and actually cross-check every byte and verify that they're all individually correct. That's going to be a huge, huge pain. Instead, you could add up all the numbers, but only keep the lowest, say, 12 digits, right? So whatever that sum comes up to, you only keep the lowest 12 digits of that. Then, and attach it and append it to the sequence, append it to the series. So at the end of your long series of numbers, you calculate this sum, you keep the lowest 12 digits of it, you append it to the series. The recipient can likewise do the sum, and if it matches the checksum, the message is almost certainly okay. Okay, because why? Because let's see if I can move this thing. It's a little, doesn't really want to move for me. There we go. I had it. There we go. Message is almost certainly okay. Why? Because number one, most messages are going to make it through safely, and number two, the probability that the message is actually corrupted in such a way that the checksum remains constant is very, very small. But, you know, at most, 1 in 10 to the 12th, right? 1 in a trillion chance. So this is a kind of hash function. Essentially what a hash function is, you have some arbitrarily large range of inputs. Let's move that up a bit. If I can grab it. Okay, arbitrarily large range of inputs converted to known number of hash values. Okay, and so in this case, the number of possible inputs, right, would be as long as the message could be, you know, as many 12-digit numbers. So here, you know, I just mentioned, I'll do it in red. Long series of big numbers. Very, very many possibilities. Okay. Down here, the known number of hash values is just 1 times 10 to the 12th, right? Which is a bunch of numbers, sure, but way smaller than this, right? This is a tiny fraction of that. So this is kind of a trade-off. Trade-off between perfect certitude, right? Certitude and processing speed. Okay, so a hash value, right? This sort of checks something. It's not going to give you absolute certainty that the message wasn't corrupted somehow, but it runs really fast and it gives a very high probability. So for many applications, that is an entirely reasonable trade-off. Okay, but that's what hashing is. Okay, so we take this very large range of inputs and translate them into some, you know, finite set, very small set of hash values. Okay. So questions on that stuff. Let's bring it back up. Questions on no, hackers find ways to, well, remember, okay, so we have a question here. No, hackers can find ways to hack into their encrypted emails. Well, remember what I said back at the start of security, right? If there is a key, the key can always be gotten somehow, right? But what it is, an encrypted message is so difficult to crack the encryption that the bad guys are going to try some other way. Sure. Well, I mean, this is going to be recorded and posted. So, although it's almost impossible to hack an encrypted email, what people might do is a phishing attack and try to get people to give up passwords, or they might try to install some hardware or software that actually does keystroke logging and they capture it that way. It's a much better shot than trying to guess at encryption. Okay. Yeah, the Hillary cleansing, well, Hillary's emails as such were not leaked. It was the emails from the DNC, right? So and some of those were like from Hillary, but yeah, basically they gave away the keys. There were some Russian hackers that did a phishing attack on the DNC headquarters, and some of that got through that way. Right? They basically presented a thing that said, hey, your password needs to be changed. It's very urgent for security purposes. And there was an intern working there on a Sunday morning, probably hungover, clicked the wrong thing. Instead of discarding the email, kicked it up to the DNC chair and said, hey, this needs your attention. Please go there and update your password. And so he did that and gave away the keys. So yeah, phishing attacks have a much, much, much greater chance of success than just hacking at, you know, guessing at encryption. And in fact, you know, people, of course, had tried to phish the DNC, and I'm sure the Republicans, you know, I'm sure they were trying to phish them as well. Yeah. And you can phish an almost unlimited number of times, right? So eventually one of them might probably work. Okay. Anyway, there's links in the slides if you want to check that out. But moving on. Okay, good. We got something? Not conventionally. No, not conventionally, unless you, say, direct them to a compromised website, okay, or compromised web page. What actually happens in practice, the bad guys will hack a web server and serve up basically malicious versions of the page, right? So like sometimes you go to Facebook and you click on a link and it sends you to one of those pages where there's a big pop-up that says, you know, this site is blah, 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 and it's real bad, and Microsoft Windows, blah, 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 blah. Please enter your password to resolve this problem. Yeah, that's what the bad guys have done. They've hacked the web server, and perhaps they've you know, done something on Facebook, you know, posted the article independently, but most likely they're aware that it's a popular article on Facebook and they try to hack it that way. we'll talk a little bit more about this in lecture too. Very interesting. Okay. Okay, so that's hashing. Very good. And so the point of this hashing is at the end, right? If the checksum on the whole message matches the checksum that I locally calculate after I receive it, then I can be pretty sure that the message has not been tampered with. It's still in its original form, which is good, which is something that you generally want to know. Okay, a few more things. So number one, spam accounts, right? So Facebook has to deal with this problem a lot. Spam accounts created for a fake persona, typically to deceive or harm other users, right? Sometimes people use it for advertising, like you might create a whole bunch of fake accounts to talk about how awesome some new product is when in fact it's absolute crap and nobody's tried it, or you're running a scam. There actually is no product, but you're trying to get people interested in it, so you do these fake reviews with these spam accounts. Could be a contact for criminal activity, right? So of course, if you go to Facebook and you get a random contact from some very attractive woman, well, there's a good chance that if it is a woman, she's probably a prostitute. And unless you're into that, which I guess is your business, if it's, from an attractive man, well, chances are it's a money scam, right? It's going to be somebody who says, oh man, I'm stuck at the airport and I need $1,000 to get back home and my mom's dying of liver cancer and, oh, you got to help me. You're my only friend, right? Shit like that. Influencing public opinion, right? So in election seasons, of course, there's been quite a bit of this where people will create fake accounts to make it look like the candidates are more popular than they are. In fact, I was just reading an article the other day about how although there's some of it in the United States, there was actually a tremendous amount of it going on in countries outside North America and Europe. So a lot of politicians around the world were using Facebook and fake accounts there to make themselves seem more popular. And of course, you can use the fake accounts as a mechanism to gather information about other users. For example, you can try to learn some personal information about them that somehow you might use against them, try to guess at their passwords, things like that. So how do we recognize a spam account? Well, number one, little to no personal information, no posts, no photos. It's like they just have their profile picture, maybe 2 or 3 friends, often fake humans or people that have agreed to sign up, and almost no activity. So negligible interaction with their friends, right? So most people, they join Facebook, they at least have a little window right away where they're finding new friends and checking stuff out and doing some stuff, right? Spam account, probably not going to see that. In particular, for spam accounts, there'll be a single dominant activity type. So if it's a contact for criminal activity, right? So if it's somebody running some kind of money scam on you, yeah, a lot of their communication with you is going to be instant message, right? They're going to talk to you. If their activity is about influencing public opinion, they're going to go to a lot of pages that are, around a particular person or a particular product. They're going to press the like button a lot. They're going to just post simple, short messages. Yeah, that's awesome. So true, that sort of thing. And last, a burst of friend requests or bursts. So when you're on Facebook, when you first join there, you don't instantly go out and, send random friend requests to like 1,000 people on the first day, right? A normal person on Facebook joins, they find they search a little bit, they find some people that maybe they went to school. Once they've made friends with a couple of them, then they branch out and they make friends with other friends of those, because people tend to pool together, right? Like people who went to the same school or had the same activity, whatever. They join in clusters like that, right? But a spam account doesn't have any of that social circle. And so what they'll probably end up doing is just sending out a random burst of a few thousand friend requests, most of which will get ignored or turned down. So that's how, in practice, you can recognize them. Question is, how do they keep on living? Well, a lot of it is like spam that you get in your email box. So the bad guys, they want to build, Facebook starts off by saying, here's what we know about a reasonable profile of normal behavior. Anytime they see something that deviates very strongly from that, for example, sending out 10,000 friend requests in an hour that no human ever would do, right? That's going to be a huge red flag. Also, if accounts get flagged by users, right? So yeah, for example, on Facebook, every now and then I get a friend request from somebody with whom I have no common friends and who's, wearing pretty much just a bikini top and is way too young for me, you know, I could flag that and say, yeah, I don't think this is a real account. I can't imagine she actually wants to be friends on Facebook with me. Now, some false positives, some false negatives are inevitable. Sometimes you're going to guess wrong, right? You might have an oddball person on Facebook who's actually a human and just sends out a whole bunch of friend requests to random people because he's weird. You might, you know, fail to recognize some spam accounts because they don't send out so many requests, right? That's essentially what happens. So Facebook can recognize the worst examples, but they're not going to catch all of them. The way the spam accounts survive, number one, they operate at small scale, right? So if there's a spam account, but it's basically not doing very much, Facebook is going to say, okay, this might be a fake account, or it might be just somebody who created an account and never really did much with it. And they're not going to automatically delete it because they want to keep their user numbers up. Number two, recycling accounts, right? Of course, if a spam account gets destroyed, it's very easy for the account creator to just get a new email address and create a new account and operate with a little more discretion, right? Instead of sending out 100 friend requests an hour, maybe they send out 10 or so a day for the first few days. And maybe that's enough that it doesn't trigger any red flags at Facebook. But again, of course, the arms race never ends. Facebook, they're trying to figure out new ways to detect spam accounts, and the spam accounts, you know, whatever methods Facebook comes up with, the ones that survive will be the ones that are more closely mimicking actual human behavior. Okay. Security versus usability. Now, there's a quote that I lifted here. I forget where I lifted it from, but it's a good one. Two kinds of businesses, ones that have been hacked and ones that don't know it, right? So the idea there, every business has been compromised to some degree, right? It may not be to a critical degree, but yeah, it's, you know, security vulnerabilities are inevitable. Breaches are inevitable. Now, perfect security is impossible, right? We've established that as a dogma early on. If the keys exist, you can't keep the keys entirely safe. Someone could get access to them, make a copy, whatever. So because of that, managers have to balance usability against security, right? It is entirely possible to make a system that is very secure, but is also a colossal pain for users to actually use. In fact, way back when I was in grad school, there was a woman at University of Illinois at Chambana that this was exactly her field. She researched how employees did workarounds for security obligations that managers put on them. So let's talk for a second. We'll talk about that. It's kind of a neat topic, right? Because the topic of how users evade intentions is always a good one. So, for example, suppose we start off with a situation like this. Number one, managers decree that all users must change their passwords every week, okay? That can have a number of bad consequences, right? Number one, lots of calls for forgotten passwords, right? Because people just aren't remembering they're changing them. Number two, what else could happen? Users keep very simple, easy to remember passwords, right? And number three, users rotate a small set of related passwords, right? So something like PWord, PW001, PW002, and so on, okay? All of those are not really going to help security very much, right? These are all problems. So we can follow up with that. Number two, managers recognize this. Managers decree that all passwords must be entirely new and composed of weird, random character sequences. Okay? Like, right? Something like that. Well, what can happen then? Well, number one, right, again, even more forgotten password calls. Number two, all right, what else happens after that? Humans start writing passwords on paper, right? And keeping, say, in their cubicle, right? That's where they keep their stuff. So then people see them, right? Or we're in the age of Zoom. Maybe somebody's working from home and somebody spots that piece of paper that's sitting there at their work desk that has their passwords on it. So security gets lost. So security gets lost. So what could be a final consequence of that, right? Managers require, blah, 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 next logical step of evolution. Well, what happens then? Maybe the humans abandon the system to the greatest extent possible, right? Which means workarounds become common, like ID admin, password admin, right? Stuff like that. If you have people that are working there and they say, gosh, this whole thing is a giant pain in the ass. I have to record some giant string of passwords, and they've got people regularly inspecting my cubicle to make sure I'm not writing it down anywhere. I'm just going to call the guys down at security, and we'll see if we can make a backdoor workaround, something like this. Yeah, these are the sort of problems that actually happen in real life. So, key takeaway: imposing stricter security requirements will not necessarily make your system more secure, because humans are not robots, right? They don't always follow the intent of security requirements. That's life. Okay. Now, the rest of this that we're going to talk about will be a little bit of history about what Facebook has experienced over the years and security threats in general. So I think what we'll do, we'll talk about just security threats today, and then on Thursday, we'll continue with what Facebook has actually experienced, and then follow up with the exam review. Okay, so we'll talk about security threats, basic ones. First one, a brute force attack. So in computer science or algorithms, whatever, a brute force something is an algorithm that tries to go through every possibility in order to find the best one. So a brute force attack on a password looks at literally every possible combination of characters that could be a valid password. The good thing about a brute force attack is it will eventually work, right? Given enough time, a brute force attack will definitely crack the password. The downside is it could be a really, 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 really long time. So, practical solutions. Number one, using strong passwords, right? If you use a strong password that has a large number of characters and a large number of possibilities for each character, it's going to be very difficult to guess randomly, and so a brute force attack would take a really long time. Other possibilities: enforced delays or locking the account after a number of failed attempts, right? So our kids, they occasionally try to log into their iPads, to get past some controls we put in, but after a few wrong guesses, they got locked out for a few minutes, and then they stop and they ask us to, do whatever. So in a well-designed system, brute force attacks are not a severe threat, right? Because it's very unlikely that anyone will be able to guess the password before the account gets locked. Having said that, not all systems are well designed. We'll come back to that. Number two, guessing and stealing, right? So guessing a password might seem impossible, but it does happen. For example, passwords that include personal data, or in particular are composed entirely of personal data. For example, your dog's name and the year you were born, stuff like that. Those are the passwords that are easily guessed. Other passwords, including common words, hackers can try that same password on millions of accounts, right? So they could try something like donut123, and there's probably some people out there that have that as their password. Ways they could be stolen: number one, intercepting wireless data. If these passwords are sent in clear text, installing a keystroke logger on some kind of public machine, Malware access to locally stored passwords, right? If you somehow infect somebody's machine, and one of the things you do with that is you grab everything that store in their browser, all their saved passwords, and then at some point you deliver that to yourself. Obtaining identical passwords from insecure sites, right? So maybe your Facebook account is secure, but you use that same password on a whole bunch of other crappy sites, like some random trivia site that you then forgot about. And 4 years later, it gets hacked and they get all the passwords because they're stored there in plain text. And so the bad guys, they try those same passwords with your email. They try it on Facebook. They try it on banking sites, stuff like that. They eventually find some hits. They try it on your Gmail account, whatever. And then phishing, right? Phishing attacks, well, here we go. So phishing is probably the most popular and successful method for getting access credentials. So once upon a time, it was not especially difficult to guess passwords. There's a reason from 1984 or 83, maybe it was 83. There was a movie called War Games starring a very young Matthew Broderick where he was a bored teenage computer hacker, and he hacked into some Department of the Defense system that had a 4-number passcode and no lockout after a number of tries. So basically, he did a quick brute force attack on that, got through, yeah. And again, that was Department of Defense, so you would think pretty good security for those days. Anyway, so yeah, for a while you could do stuff like that. You could do these dictionary attacks or guess at passwords and have a reasonable shot at them. But eventually, most of the good websites started requiring people to do oddball passwords, which meant that sort of random guessing didn't work anymore. So the next thing, phishing, right? Phishing is the way that you try to trick somebody into giving up their password. So typical stuff, send an email advising the reader that there's a problem, they need to log into their account and fix it, and they include a helpful email link, right there in the message. So then the reader visits the site, enters the ID and password, and boom, they've given away the keys. Or you can send somebody an email with some kind of malware attachment, right? Some kind of executable file. So this was a thing that people used to send, .exe attachments, and there were people that were fool enough to open them, or things like infected PDF documents, stuff like that. People often do. Now, this is something especially a lot of older people have trouble with. For example, it was about 10 years ago. My mom, who was about 80 at the time, she calls me up in a bit of a panic, and she says, Doug, I have this big problem. I say, okay, what is it? And she says, well, I got an email from Bank of America. They said that, I need to go in and change my password. And I said, okay. And they said, and if I don't do it, they're going to have to, shut down my account. And I said, okay. And it says, but I don't have a Bank of America account. And I said, oh, well, okay, Mom. So this is what's called phishing and blah, 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 blah. And, I explained to her that stuff was okay. So, yeah, they send out a lot of those kind of messages to people who don't even have an account on the website of concern. Okay. So that's phishing. Phishing, basically, you try to convince the other person to give up their access credentials. Now, for phishing, preserving the illusion of legitimacy is obviously critical. Number one reason, there's typically a very long delay before the damage happens. Usually the phishers are not the ones that are actually interested in the data. What they typically do is they do a bunch of phishing attacks. Some of them are going to be successful, most aren't, but the ones that are, they bundle up those access credentials together and they sell them on the dark net, right? They sell them on the dark web for a few dollars. So if you feel that you've been phished, of course, first thing you want to do is change your passwords immediately. So, if you have an email and you respond to it and you give away your passwords, and then, a few minutes later you think, that was kind of a weird looking email. There were a lot of misspelled words in there for something corporate. And then you say, you know what, just to be safe, I'm going to go back and change my password. Yeah, you're almost certainly safe. So to preserve legitimacy, right, phishers do things like use phony but plausible email source addresses. So, if there's an email that you get from bad guys at North Korea, you're probably going to think, oh, maybe that's kind of bad, right? But if it's something that's, security at Sony.net, then people are going to say, yeah, okay, that's our security team. So sure, fine. Other stuff they might do, use a phony site with a similar appearing name, or otherwise reorder terms. For example, there might be a part of the Target website that's target.help.com, but targethelp.com would be a completely different website, not affiliated with Target. Other things you can do, once people give away their password and ID, then you say, oh, sorry, you must have typed in something wrong. Then redirect them to that same page on the legitimate website, and then say, here, enter your stuff. Yeah, and then they get in, and they don't have a quick, if they don't think about it, they'll just say, oh, yeah, I must have typed in the stuff wrong, but here I am, and the site is legitimate, and everything's good. So those are some of the tricks that phishers use. Another related thing, spoofing. So spoofing is not inherently a problem. So if you've ever seen, I'm going to pop this into W3 Schools. W3 Schools, try it. Okay, so one thing you can do, right, if you have a, I don't really want JavaScript here, but one thing you can do if you have a link, I'm going to create a hyperlink here. So href equals okay. Here, I have the text display one thing, go to UIC, right? It doesn't actually display uic.edu. But if I click on the link, let's see if I do that in a new tab. I got this new Orbi thing. It doesn't like to direct me to new sites. But anyway, it would send, if I didn't have this elevated security at my house, yeah, this would send me to the UIC page. Okay, so this is essentially a kind of spoofing, right? Here's the text that I see for the link, but here's where the link actually sends me. And the link doesn't match the reference. That same sort of thing they can do in an email, right? They can have the link text be anything in an email, but it directs you to somewhere else. So it could say something like, our helpful assistance at target.com, but it actually links you to some oddball site that the hackers are working out of, but you don't see that. So spoofing is misrepresenting a name, like an internet address, website name, email address, whatever. So phishing naturally uses that kind of disguising to entice people to open and trust the email message, right? If the link said, hackers@hackers.net, you're not going to open it. But if it says help@target.com, yeah, maybe you're going to click that. Okay. Now, in most emails, most of the time, if you do hover the cursor over a link, most browsers, email applications, you should see a pop-up that shows the actual link destination. So if you're ever worried about that, think it's a little sketchy, yeah, just hover over it and you should see where the link will actually take you. Okay, so that's phishing and some of the tricks thereof. Now, the way phishing works, it typically casts a very wide net. So think of one of those great big ships cruising across the ocean, throwing out a net the size of a football field, just trying to catch a bunch of fish, right? The attackers don't especially care whose accounts they compromise. What they do, they send out literally millions of these kind of phishing attacks in the expectation that they're not going to get very many hits, but they need a large volume of attacks to get a small number of successes. However, if you are an important or notable individual, you may be targeted individually, right? So I have another article there about the DNC hacks. Very clearly, they were trying to get, top people at the DNC to give up their credentials so they could see all the email. Another link there about Sony. You guys may remember some years ago, they had that movie with Seth Rogen and James Franco about assassinating the North Korean dictator, was Kim Jong-un. Yeah. Anyway, so the attackers pretended, they were internal, right? They say fake Apple ID emails, but yeah, the attacks looked like they came from within Sony itself, and that's how the executives eventually were targeted. So spear phishing just basically means you're targeting a specific individual for phishing, right? Because if you're going after somebody with a spear, going after actual fishes with a spear, you're only going to catch one of them. Right? Regular fishing, you throw out a net, there's millions of fish in the sea, you catch a few hundred. Spear fishing, there's a particular fish you have your eye on, and you target it. Okay. Next thing, multi-stage attacks. So if you got an email in your mailbox from some random clown, you'd probably ignore it, right? If it has some weird address, some name you heard of, you don't know who they are, you say, oh yeah, it's probably some spam garbage, whatever. But if it appeared to come from your own IT department with a legitimate email, or better yet, if it actually did come from your own IT department with a legitimate email, you'd probably say, okay, yeah, this I'll do. All right, if it asks you to go into their server and update your password, and it looks like the server they're directing you to is actually the regular company's one, yeah, you'd probably do it. So multi-stage attacks attempt to get that level of credibility. Basically, they acquire credentials of IT security employees, use those accounts to phish employees with elevated access levels, and then once they've gathered all the data they want, they try to exfiltrate it. That means basically get it out of the organization, run for the gates as fast as they can. And typically that'll get migrated to some kind of anonymous file sharing services, right? So they'll download, megabytes, gigabytes of data to some file sharing service, and that'll echo the data to another file sharing service. And by the time anybody can catch up with it, the trail's already gone cold. It's gone through several of them, and they're just never going to find it. So this is the sort of thing like with the Sony emails. This is basically the mechanism that happened in there. So they targeted some low-level employees, eventually got some access credentials of security employees, used those security the emails from the Sony security people to target the executives at the top and say, hey, we need to update your email. Yeah, your email access. And they said, okay, yeah, here's my account. It's updated now. Well, that's what happened. Okay. So something like this is a fairly, representative process. Okay, a few more. Denial of service attacks. You may have heard of those. Denial of service attack essentially attempts to overload the network with connection requests. So you have a bunch of outside, a basic denial of service attack. You have one machine that repeatedly tries to connect to the server, possibly through a bunch of different ports on itself. So it tries to overload the network with too many connection requests, forces the network to respond to these repeated small communications so that not much else can happen on the network. Way back in the 90s, when America Online was still a thing, that was one of the tricks people would use in the chat rooms, right? They would basically send the ping of death to people if they wanted to boot them from a chat room. They would send them some kind of data packet that took so long to process it that their connection would time out and they'd get booted from the room. So this kind of denial of service attack, it's not especially new. Now, if it's an attack from a single machine, it's very easy for the network administrators to block, right? They just recognize that machine's IP address and they say, oh, we're going to block traffic from the IP address for a while, and then they don't have anything to worry about. But more advanced attacks, you get entire groups of attacking machines, possibly from around the world. That's what's called a distributed denial of service attack, because the attack is distributed over a large set of machines. Typically, these sort of attacks rely on what are called botnets, groups of infected machines. In most cases, the owners don't know that the machines are infected. Okay, but the bad guys, they have thousands, maybe even millions of machines out there, and if they want to do a distributed denial of service attack on someone, yeah, they have the capabilities to do it. So the solution to that, besides having backup capacity, right? So that's one obvious thing, is have backup capacity to deal with an unusually large number of connection requests. But the real remedy is this. Distributed denial of service attack, if it's going to be effective, it's also going to be too large to be controlled manually. There's going to be some kind of predictable cycle where these devices all go on at coordinated times, and the network administrators can just see, okay, who's trying to connect at the same time, and they'll recognize these groups of machines and be able to block them individually, and then they won't have to worry about the connection request. So eventually, yeah, they'll be able to block the distributed denial of service attack, but until they do, right, it's still going to have some negative impact. It's still going to clog things up for a while. Okay, so you cannot completely block a distributed denial of service attack, but it's usually something you can fix. You can block future connections, eventually. Okay, another one, cross-site scripting. So cross-site scripting, the basic mechanism for that, you have a web page, some mechanism in there that's used for input that injects active code into a user's browser. It's similar to a SQL injection attack that we'll talk about in a moment, but with executable JavaScript. Okay, so let me give an example. Good. Okay, so we'll do a wrong thing, yeah. A simple cross-site scripting. Okay. Imagine if you're on Facebook, okay, and you have posted a nice picture of yourself on vacation and the weather's nice and there's some sun there and that's great and it's a lovely day. Hooray. Well, down below there's going to be some boxes, right? So person number one, we'll write something like, wow, looks nice. Person number two writes, wish I was there. Person number three, in the, let me try to do this, puts in an HTML tag containing a script. All right, so what am I doing here? All right. Okay, so something like script, bad stuff, end script. Okay, now, if the browser is not sophisticated, right, if the website and browser are not sophisticated, the script could potentially run as active code. And if malicious, could damage your machine, right? Like installing malware from some other source. Now, of course, Facebook is onto this. They're not going to let this sort of stuff happen in 2020 for sure. But this is the basic idea. If there's some sort of input mechanism, you find a way to surprise people by injecting active code into there, that's one way to do it. Okay, so simple cross-site scripting. Now, of course, they're much more sophisticated than this, and I'm going to tell you right up front, I am not a security expert. I don't have details about advanced cross-site scripting attacks. I do know that they are one of the more common, active, dangerous mechanisms out there. So cross-site scripting and phishing are probably the big two at this point. So this is a serious thing. This is an example of how it could happen, but of course, the way they do it is more sophisticated than that. Okay. Last one we'll do, SQL injection. Okay, I believe that's, yeah, good. So SQL injection is a way of injecting active SQL code. SQL is, by the way, the language of database operations. So SQL code, mostly obsolete, and depends on how passwords are checked in SQL. So 20 years ago, yeah, there were probably a lot of databases where this sort of thing would work. Nowadays, probably hardly any. So we'll give an example. I'm going to pop this down so I can put the text in. I'm going to put the text in Paint here. Okay, imagine if this is my command in SQL. So what I'm going to say here, I'll put a little blurb on the side. This finds all the matches in the table users where the input ID matches name and the input password matches password. Okay, so that's what we're doing here. We're saying select star. Star is a wild character from the table users where the name matches and the password matches. So essentially, you find the one record in users where the name field matches the user ID that was entered and where the password field matches the password that was entered. Okay, there should be only one, of course. There should only be one match at most. Okay, now with SQL injection, they put some extra code in there. Okay, so this part here, I'm gonna highlight that. Let's put that in orange, I guess. They inject a little bit of extra code. Oh, it should be this too. That should also be orange. So they inject this extra bit of code in here. So instead of password equals password, they have password equals or 1 equals 1. And so when it gets processed as name matches name and password equals an empty string, right? Nothing, or 1 equals 1. Well, 1 is always going to equal 1. 1 will always equal 1. So this attack will grant an attacker some kind of access credential, okay, for name. All right, so whoever the user's name is, right, you're automatically going to get that access, because what you'll get the record where the name matches, and then this will definitely happen. So it'll just pull the one, you'll get that for whatever name you put in. If it's a valid account, you're going to get those access credentials. And again, this is a SQL injection account, a SQL injection attack. It relies on injecting active SQL code, active executable SQL code into the password block. Not really going to work on most systems these days, though, because they're onto it. Okay. So that's it. That's it. We'll come back on Thursday. We'll do an overview of Facebook attacks. So I'm going to check back here. Let's see what we got. Okay, yeah, old Prince from Nigeria email scam. Yes, more. That never goes away. Okay. So I am done with the lecture. I'm still recording. Does anyone have any last-minute questions? I hope this has been an interesting lecture. Questions, anyone? All right, thank you. Yep. I'll talk about stuff on Thursday. I'll put up a couple things. Okay, I'll put up a couple things tonight and talk about those on Thursday. All right. All right, we'll see you.